Would you do this to someone?
Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing super well. Thank you all so much for being here. Today's case is truly terrifying. It's honestly one of my biggest fears, and I don't even have kids yet, but still, this is something that I'm always just thinking about. We're going to be discussing the abduction of 8-year-old Sarah Payne. For 17 agonizing days, the Payne family and the community held on to hope, praying for Sarah's safe return. Unfortunately, the Payne family didn't get the ending that they were praying for. What happened to Sarah is just extremely upsetting. It's frightening, and her death was an absolute tragedy that terribly affected her family. Her story impacted people worldwide and prompted changes in child protection laws in the UK. This is just something that you think would never happen to your child. What happened to Sarah not only brings awareness to child protection laws, but it also brings awareness to stranger danger and to child safety measures that we should all be aware of. I'm going to have some resources linked down below where you can learn more about this, as well as some amazing organizations that help Sarah's family get through this difficult time. With that, thank you all so much for being here and for taking the time to listen to today's video. I appreciate you guys so much. You guys are literally the best familia ever, and if you guys are new to this channel, welcome, bienvenidos. I hope you guys can hit the subscribe button down below and be a part of the familia. This video might be a little bit long. Honestly, I feel like it's going to be like maybe an hour long, so get some water and let's sit down and let's talk about what happened to Sarah. Sarah Evelyn Isabel Payne was born on October 13th, 1991 to her parents Sarah and Michael in the heart of the Elmbridge district, Hersham in Surrey, England. Now, Sarah's mom spells her name without an H and Sarah spells her name with an H, so it might get a little bit confusing when I talk about both of them since they have the same name. If I get to a point where I'm like referencing them at the same time, I'll refer to her mom as Sarah's mom and as Sarah, the child, as just Sarah. So Sarah grew up with two older brothers, Lee and Luke, and with a younger sister named Charlotte. Their mom said she and Michael were not expecting another child after Lee and Luke, but they welcomed baby Sarah with open arms and she was beyond excited to finally have a girl. She could choose out like cute little pink girly dresses and shop for dolls and things like that because, she had two other boys, so it's not something she really got to experience with them, so she was just so excited to finally have a girl and like be girly with her. Sarah and Michael called Sarah their princess, and when Charlotte came along a few years later, it was just like amazing. Like Sarah could now have a sister and she could play dolls with her, and their family was just growing and it was just such a beautiful time. Honestly, there truly is nothing like having a sister. It's just like one of the best relationships to have. Sarah and her siblings were all very close. They loved playing games together. They would play hide and seek and things like that. Charlotte and Sarah loved singing and dancing to Spice Girls in their room that they shared together, and Charlotte says that she remembers wanting to be just like Sarah, which is just like a typical thing that younger siblings want. Like you always look up to your older siblings and you always just like want what they have and just want to be them. So I think that's just such a cute little memory that Charlotte has. Luke says that Sarah was always in her mom's makeup and clothes and stuff like that as well, which I definitely have a memory of doing that as well. Like I remember I would grab my mom's makeup bag and I would put on her lipsticks and her mascara and like brush my eyebrows and stuff like that. So that's definitely such a cute memory. And Sarah would also like play princesses and fairies. So it's just very cute how Sarah was kind of like the more girly girl of the two sisters because she just loved dress up and makeup and things like that. Anyways, after Charlotte was born, they were now a family of 6, which is quite a big family. Sarah's mom fondly remembers the chaos of life with 4 kids. The rushed mornings spent preparing breakfast, getting everyone dressed for school and gathering all of their supplies. It was just honestly chaotic every single morning, and this often led to them being late to school and to like other activities, but despite the chaos, it was a beautiful chapter to live through. This was a time when her family was whole, when they were together and happy. A chapter that was unfortunately abruptly cut short on July 1st, 2000. That summer day, the Payne family was visiting Michael's parents in the quiet beach village of Kingston Gorse in West Sussex, England. The children loved going to their grandparents' house since they were walking distance from the beach, and because their house was on a large piece of land with like high crops nearby, which they could run through and like play games under the warm sun for hours. It was honestly like the perfect way to spend their summer days. They would go to the beach in the morning, and then in the afternoon they would play in their grandparents' yard, and it was just a wonderful time. The The parents, Sarah and Michael, also loved going there because it was a time where they could just like relax and enjoy some quiet time while the kids were playing amongst themselves. So on July 1st, 2000, that's exactly what happened. Everyone but Leslie, their grandma, was taking a stroll along the beach, and at around 7 p.m., Michael's father, Terrence, suggested that they take a walk up to a nearby house he had just finished painting to kind of like take a look at it before heading back to the main house. Not a big no, but I read some sources saying that he painted the house and others saying that his friend did. Regardless, they stopped at this house because they just wanted to look at this house before going back home. So while the parents did that, Sarah and her siblings were having the best time ever playing at the beach with their dog that they didn't want to leave quite yet. They wanted to stay just a little bit longer. So Sarah's mom was like, okay, you guys can stay and keep playing, but she told Sarah, who was 8 years old at the time, that her brothers were in charge and that she had to do exactly as they said. Lee was 13 years old at this time, Luke was 11 years old, Sarah was 8, and Charlotte was 5. Sarah agreed to these rules and they all kept playing as their mom and their dad waved goodbye. So the children stayed at the beach playing for a bit, and then they made their way up to the cornfield that was right in front of their grandparents' house. There was a rope swing that they would often swing on, and they began playing a game of dinosaurs where they would kind of like chase each other throughout the cornfield and like pretend to be dinosaurs. They were all playing this game of dinosaurs when all of a sudden Sarah fell and hurt herself on accident. She began crying and she was upset that the fun was in a sense ruined now, so she quickly got up and said that she was going to go back home, that she didn't want to play anymore. Luke ran up to her and grabbed her, trying to tell her that it was okay, that it was just an accident and that everything would be fine and that she should just continue playing with them, but if she didn't really want to stay, then she should at least stay nearby until they finished playing so that they could all go back to the house together, you know, kind of have like the buddy system. But again, Sarah was just really upset that she hurt herself and she kind of just ignored her brother. She let loose of his grip and stormed off and said that she was going to Nanny's house. He was annoyed that Sarah wasn't listening to him, so he said, off, go home, and then Sarah began making her way out of the cornfield. I understand that Luke feels regret about his last words to his sister, but I mean, you know, I have sisters too, so like sometimes you fight and you say things that you don't mean, and then the next second you're fine and you're like acting completely normal. You never truly actually mean the words that you say when you're annoyed or frustrated. Siblings just fight sometimes, and I really hope that Luke can just make peace with this last conversation that he had with Sarah, and I hope he heals from it, and I hope he knows that none of this was his fault. So after this, Sarah was now making her way back to the house, and Lee thought that maybe he could kind of speak to her, calm her down, and have her stay. Sarah was making her way through this like gap in the tall crops that led to the road back to their grandparents' house on Kingston Lane. Lee saw her and he cut through the cornfield diagonally to catch up to her quicker as she went through the gap and onto the road. But Lee turned his head back for only a second when he heard that Charlotte, his other sister, also hurt herself. Now, despite Lee being only seconds behind his sister Sarah and only taking his eyes off of her for literally a split second, when he turned back around to where Sarah was gone. Lee was almost within touching distance of Sarah, but all of a sudden he could no longer see her. She had disappeared. It was literally as if she had just vanished into thin air. Like, it made no sense. Lee has explained this in interviews, and he's like, I literally was looking at her, turned around for a second to look at my other sister who was crying, and when I looked back, she was gone.
She beat me out of the field, walked around the road, which is 100 metres, if that. By the time I was there, she was gone. So it's literally 30 seconds, if that, behind her. Yeah.
Lee was looking around for Sarah when the sound of screechy tires made him turn his head. A man driving a white van was seen slowly passing by. Lee actually made eye contact with the driver, who grinned at him and waved eerily to him before just speeding off. Lee was so confused as to why this creepy man in a dingy van was grinning and waving at him, but his only focus at that moment was finding Sarah. Lee kept looking around for her, but she was nowhere to be found. There was no sign of her. Lee called and called her name, but got no answer. Shortly after, Lee, Luke, and Charlotte ran to their grandparents' home, where only Leslie was because, again, Sarah, Michael, and Terrence had stopped by to look at the house and like were doing their own thing. So it was just Grandma Leslie at the house, and they all ran in and said that they just couldn't find Sarah. Shortly later, the mom, the dad, and the grandpa arrived, and Sarah's mom says that when she approached the house, she could see that Leslie looked really worried and that she was grabbing Charlotte's hand very tightly politely. As soon as she saw them, Leslie said, "Is Sarah with you?" To which Sarah replied, "No, of course I haven't got Sarah. Why would I have Sarah? She's with you." And that's when the boys chimed in and said that they couldn't find Sarah anywhere. Sarah's mom said that when she heard this, it was like a fog descended and she just felt like she couldn't breathe. The family immediately began searching for Sarah, and the mom again was just in disbelief and fear that no one could find her daughter. She said, quote, "I was walking around and people were talking to me. I was answering, but it wasn't me." In the hour before they called the police, there were already around 100 people helping look for Sarah. Her mom didn't really want to call the police right away because if she did, then that meant that all of this was real. She didn't want to believe that her daughter was truly missing. When police did arrive, they organized search parties with people on foot, and they even had helicopters and thermal imaging cameras scanning the area. Homes were being searched, cars, nearby fields, gardens, everything was being looked at. Sarah was wearing black nylon shoes with Velcro straps and a blue style tennis dress, so everyone was on the lookout for a little girl matching that description. A female police officer stayed by Sarah's side the whole time while everyone searched. I mean, of course, Sarah's mom was just absolutely heartbroken. She was just filled with nerves because her daughter was missing. Her daughter was also afraid of the dark, and it was getting dark out now, so all Sarah's mom could think about was how scared her daughter must be. She was holding on to hope that her daughter would be found and returned safely. It's so important to hold on to hope in this moment and to think positive when you're in these type of situations, despite what statistics may say. Now, let's quickly talk about those statistics because according to Laura Richards, a criminal behavior analyst, 44% of missing children are killed within the first hour they are missing, 73% are killed within the first 3 hours, and 99% of them are killed within the first 24 hours. Those statistics are extremely frightening, but they're also very important to be aware of. Each minute was crucial in the search for Sarah, which is why so many people were helping and why police began the searches immediately. Around midnight, police learned of their first big clue. Lee told his mom that he in fact did recall something that stood out to him, and his mom told him that he needed to tell the police ASAP. So he told police that he saw a white van driving down the road where Sarah was, who waved and grinned at him before speeding off. And Lee was thinking that this man just seemed off, like the way that he smiled at him just made him feel so uneasy. He described this man as being dirty, scruffy, having horrible yellow teeth, and just looking really greasy and gross as if he hadn't showered or shaved in weeks. He said, quote, "He had yellowish teeth when he grinned and his eyes were really white and stood out from his face. His hair was really rough and hadn't been brushed. It was sticking up." Now, this was a huge clue. Police were now trying to find this white van and who it belonged to. Even if the man driving the van wasn't involved in Sarah's disappearance, they still could have been a witness to what happened to her, so it was crucial for police to find this man. Now, at this point, Sarah's disappearance was making its way to national news and became a nationwide search. Her photo was being put up all over town, it was being passed around by everyone, and her case was also appearing on the news, which was so helpful. Sarah and Michael made numerous TV appearances pleading for Sarah's safe return and to just keep her name in the public eye. It was all just too much. I mean, the family still couldn't believe that this happened, that their little girl was missing and possibly in the hands of a stranger. They just couldn't understand why this had happened and who could have taken Sarah. On the other hand, police already had a particular suspect in mind. Investigators were mapping the area for known sex offenders, and a man who lived just 5 miles away from Sarah's grandparents' home stood out on the list. This man was 41-year-old Roy Whiting. So who was Roy? Roy William Whiting was born in Hersham, West Essex, England on January 26, 1959 to his parents George and Roy was one of 6 siblings, but 3 of them actually passed away while they were quite young. According to reports, Roy's father, George, was a convicted pedophile who essayed an 11-year-old girl at the local swimming pool when he was 36 years old. George was put on probation for a year, and after this, Pamela left him and went on to remarry. Roy grew up an isolated boy, and he didn't really have that many friends. He was kind of an outcast. He left school at 16 or 17 years old, and he kind of dabbled in different jobs like a car mechanic, a window cleaner, a delivery worker, and a building worker. During his 20s and 30s, he was also involved in stock car racing, but eventually discontinued. continued it. In 1986, he married a woman named Linda, and Linda gave birth to their son in 1987, but the two officially divorced in 1990, and Roy didn't really have much contact with his son after that. Roy and Linda just kind of like argued a lot about money and just about him. Like, he just wasn't a good person. He had rented a workshop where he worked on cars, but was evicted for not paying the rent. I'm sure not only money was a contributing factor to the divorce, but also probably the fact that Linda was grossed out by Roy. People described Roy as a very dirty person who was always greasy from his work with cars, and they describe him as being someone who had a strong, foul odor of urine and just body odor, as if he only showered once a month. Not only was his appearance gross, but so was his behavior. Colleagues and neighbors said that they recall seeing Roy hanging around schoolyards with sweet treats during school dismissal hours. Why was he doing that? Because he was just an overall gross and creepy guy. Like, who hangs out at a school where your kid doesn't even go to try to like pass out sweets to kids? Anyways, there were also reports stating that that same year, 1990, a girlfriend of another woman he had been with gave birth to their daughter. According to the mother, which I wasn't able to find her last name, Roy would creepily look at schoolgirls, and he even had sex with her when she was asleep. So Roy for sure has one son and likely a daughter as well. Years later, Roy claimed that he too was molested by his father and said that this caused great rage for him, leading him to cutting the brakes on his car and causing his father to crash into the window of a hardware store. One of Roy's old classmates, Ian, said, quote, "I remember the crash because my sister was walking along the pavement when the car came flying past. Everyone thought it was just an accident, but years later, Roy told the police that he tried to murder his father. He told them that he had tampered with the brake. Roy told them that it was because of what his father had done to him. Nobody really knows what went on behind closed doors. Roy never spoke about it." So yeah, Roy claims that his father also essayed him, and it is believed that Roy may have only come forward about this alleged, essay years later as an excuse for his own disturbing actions. I do just want to say I'm not dismissing what Roy is saying, like maybe he was essayed by his own father, but again, a lot of people just feel like he kind of said that to defend his actions. March of 1995, Roy tried kidnapping 3 young girls, but he only got one of them. He kidnapped a 9-year-old little girl, threw her in his Ford Sierra, and then ordered her to stay out of sight as he drove her to a secluded wooded area. Once there, he threatened her with a knife to strip and then essayed her before dropping her back off in her neighborhood. Once the word got out that a 9-year-old girl had been abducted and essayed, Roy sold his car and he changed his appearance. But it didn't take long for police to connect Roy to the crime after finding the car he sold. Hearing what he did is just so deeply disturbing. Like, my heart breaks for that 9-year-old little girl. I mean, thankfully he didn't, kill her, but still she has to live with that trauma for the rest of her life. Now, the owner of the car workshop that Roy worked at, named Brian, said, quote, "Thinking back, Roy did often volunteer to give lifts to my stepniece and nephew. If they were late for school or needed picking up, he would often do it in one of his cars. After the 1995 case, we asked them if he had tried anything on them, but they said he never did anything, which is an indescribable relief." That must be so scary to know that this man that was arrested for kidnapping a 9-year-old little girl and assaulting her had taken your niece and nephew to school and had given them rides. Like, thankfully Roy hadn't done anything to them, but still, it's just really crazy how you think you can trust someone and then they turn out to be a completely different person. Now, during this trial for the abduction of the 9-year-old girl, a criminal psychiatrist named Dr. Anthony Farrington told the judge that they didn't think Roy had any pedophile tendencies, and Roy's lawyer kind of just like ran with this and argued that he was clearly not a long-term risk to society and was anxious to get treatment in prison to fix himself. Now, we're going to touch on Dr. Farrington again later on because he comes into play, during Sarah's trial. But anyways, Roy's defense team was using that statement to kind of help Roy and asked the judge to deem him as not a defendant who is necessarily going to pose a risk to society afterwards. In the end, Roy was found guilty, and during his sentencing, his lawyer referenced his molestation from his dad in an attempt to shift the blame, but in the end, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison, but only served 2 years and 5 months because he did confess to abducting the 9-year-old girl and assaulting her. So because of his confession, I guess that kind of gave him some like leniency, and he only served 2 years. years, which is insane. Like 2 years for kidnapping and assaulting an 8-year-old little girl? It's ridiculous. When the judge sentenced him, he said Roy did not have premeditation in the crime, saying that the ropes and the knife that Roy had in his car were simply a coincidence, not premeditation. Years later, an expert in pedophilia named Ray Wire argued that Roy did in fact have pedophilia tendencies. The fact that he had a knife and a rope in his car, and the fact that he was confident enough to try to abduct not one, not two, but 3 girls at the same time suggested that he was a pedophile. He said that he wouldn't be surprised if Roy had attacked another child previously or would do it again in the future. During his sentence in prison, Roy wrote to Brian, the workshop owner that I mentioned earlier, apologizing and offering money for rent that he had missed. Brian said that he didn't reply to these letters, and he, along with everyone who knew Roy, were just sickened by what had happened, and everyone pretty much just dropped him from their lives. So Roy was released 2 years and 5 months later and was one of the first people to be placed on the sex offender registry. Roy asked his parole to relocate him since he knew that in his hometown he had a target on his back, because again, everyone knew what he had done and they kind of like chased him out of the town. So Roy knew that he couldn't stay in his hometown, so he chose to move to where Sarah's grandparents live because his mother had lived there since she had separated from his father. So Roy moved to this beachside village, and he ended up living in a hostel at first before moving into an apartment just a few miles away from Sarah's grandparents' house. And not only was he living near Sarah's grandparents' house where there were like other children nearby, but he was also living near a children's amusement park called Harbor Park. It's frightening to know how close he lived to children and how no one around him knew that he was a criminal. At this new town, he became a local at a fish and chip restaurant called Oscar's Fish and Chip, which was just a short walk from his house. He would hang out there a lot. You know, his go-to order was 2 mugs of tea and a hamburger. And since he was there so often, he became really close with the owner and with a few other like frequent customers. The owner said that Roy would often go there to meet with a group of friends, but that friend group ultimately fell apart and Roy would kind of just go there by himself. Roy did spend a lot of time at this fish and chip shop. Like he would be there basically every single week. He got so friendly with the employees that they kind of started doing like a lottery pool together, and they all agreed that if they won the lottery, they would share the prize money together. So yeah, that's basically how Roy's new life was after prison. He moved to a new town near the beach. He lived in an apartment. He was making friends with like locals and was doing all of this stuff because again, no one knew about his criminal history. No one knew that he had just spent 2 years in prison for abducting and assaulting a 9-year-old little girl. Now, just a couple of days before Sarah disappeared, Roy had purchased a Fiat Ducato white van from a man named Dean Fuller for about 400 pounds. Dean said that the van was in terrible condition and had wooden panels inside and rear doors with no windows. Roy did purchase 2 replacement doors for it, but overall this van was just in really bad condition. And again, we'll get back to this van in a bit. So yeah, that is a summary of who Roy was and what he was up to just days before Sarah disappeared. As you can see, this guy is not a good guy at all. Again, it's just described by everyone as being just so gross and creepy. Going back to the investigation of Sarah's disappearance, police were looking into who could have possibly taken Sarah, and again, Roy stood out because 1, he was on the sex offender registry, 2, because he lived near Sarah's grandparents' house, and 3, because of the conviction that put him on that list in the first place, shared a lot of similarities with Sarah's disappearance. However, police didn't know yet that Roy purchased a van matching Lee's description just a few days before. So on July 2nd, officers went to his home to question him, but he wasn't home. According to the owner of Oscar's Fish and Chip, Roy was at the restaurant and left at around 9 p.m. So police returned later that evening and questioned him for over an hour. He appeared indifferent when police told him about Sarah's disappearance. He said that the day Sarah disappeared, he was along the coast, that he had visited 2 parks, and after was in the town of Hove at a fun fair, and then was back at his apartment at around 9:30. And that was that. So Roy was saying that he was at 2 parks and at a fun fair, both places that have a high number of children. Like, it's just disgusting how this guy couldn't get away from them. After questioning him and not really getting anything out of him, police left but lingered nearby to see what Roy did after. They just had a bad feeling about him. Like, they just had that gut feeling like, this is our guy. So they snuck away to watch him, and after a while, they saw Roy get into this white van that he had just purchased a few days before door, and he started to kind of like rummage in the driver's side footwell. This white van that he got into, of course, matched the description of the white van Lee had seen. Roy was in there rummaging through stuff. It looked like he was trying to like get rid of things. As he was rummaging, a receipt fell to the ground. Without giving it another thought, the police just blew their cover and they went up to him right away and asked him what he was doing. Detective Sergeant Steve said his demeanor was extremely nervous. He was visibly shaking. He had problems turning off the engine of the van. His hands were shaking and he was sweating. Roy could only get out the words, "nothing," and at that moment, police got a closer look at the receipt that fell. It was a receipt showing that Roy had purchased diesel at a Buck Barn garage miles away from where he claimed to be the day Sarah disappeared. To police, this proved that he lied about his alibi, and with this, they arrested him right then and there on suspicion of abduction. Unfortunately, though, this arrest didn't last long. Roy actually had to be released 3 days later due to lack of evidence, and he refused to cooperate. He would say no comment to everything he was being questioned about. So he was released, but police still put a 24/7 surveillance team on him. They closed off his home, and investigators were just trying to find any hard evidence to link Roy to Sarah's abduction. They searched his home, but they didn't find anything. Investigators did say that his house was extremely dirty and messy. Like, it was disgusting. There was filthy dishes left everywhere. There was clothes everywhere. It was just really gross. Now, while police were searching his home, Roy went back to go live in his hometown to go live with his father. He opted for living there since news spread like wildfire that he was a person of interest in the disappearance of Sarah, and he knew that he would have a target on his back. So remember, he left his hometown after he abducted the 9-year-old little girl because he had a target on his back and because everyone hated him. So he moved to this new beach village where then Sarah was abducted, and now he had a target on his back again, so he went back to his original hometown. On July 5th, Lee took part in a police lineup where Roy was placed, but he didn't identify Roy as the man he saw. According to someone who knew Roy, he said that Roy changed his appearance before the lineup, that he no longer looked scruffy or dirty, that he actually washed up pretty well and looked different, which could be why Lee didn't recognize him. 2 days later, on Friday, July 7th, a reconstruction of Sarah's last known movements was filmed with the help of 4 local children in hopes to jog the memory of anyone who thinks they may have seen something. At this point, there were thousands and thousands of tips coming in daily, but it wasn't until July 10th when police got a seemingly significant tip. Someone claimed to have seen a girl matching Sarah's description at around 5 a.m., the day after she went missing. This woman believed that she saw Sarah at a gas station restroom and noted that she appeared upset. She asked her for her name, and the little girl told her Sarah. She said she was with a man who appeared to be 6 feet tall, in his 30s, with a solid build, and that this guy was like clean shaving, and that the little girl was wearing a blue dress, which is similar to what Sarah was wearing when she went missing. The woman said that she was unaware of a little girl being missing until later, which is why she didn't take any further action right then and there. However, after being presented a photo of Sarah, this woman couldn't say for sure if the little girl was her. And on top of that, the CCTV footage of the gas station was unable to be reviewed since it was not working at the time that this happened, so it was really hard for police to confirm the sighting. Police did release an e-fit image of the man described by the woman, which is a computer-generated image, and that did bring in thousands of more tips from basically all over the world. It took so many man-hours for police to look into all of these tips, but unfortunately, none of them led to nothing. In the meantime, Sarah's family kept appearing on the TV asking for Sarah's safe return, and said that each day and each hour gets worse and worse for them, but the belief that Sarah is out there keeps them going. Despite the overwhelming fear and uncertainty, like, they had hope. Sarah's mom clutched a white teddy bear and through tears said, "This is for you, darling. They, Lee, Luke, and Charlotte, never stop thinking about you, darling." She urged everyone to think really, really hard if they think that they saw a little girl resembling Sarah, because even if they think that they didn't see her, it could have been Sarah. They also said that Charlotte, who was only 5 years old at this time, kept talking about her big sister and was innocently asking things such as, "I think Sarah will be hungry, mommy. Do you think Sarah will be hungry? Do you think Sarah needs a cuddle?" I just can't imagine how confusing it must have been for Charlotte and for all the other siblings to understand like what's truly going on. Like, just imagine being 5 years old. Like, I'm not really sure if Charlotte understood, but Lee and Luke definitely had an idea of like, my sister is missing, someone might have taken her, and I just can't imagine how difficult that must have been to go through, and also how hard it must have been for Sarah and Michael to stay put together for the sake of their children and to not worry them. Police got another tip from a 14-year-old boy claiming that he saw Sarah being dropped off somewhere. He called 3 times to give in this tip, and of course police had to look into this tip, and they even sent scent dogs, officers, and even a helicopter to search the area, the boy said, but it turned out to be a fake tip. Police were able to track down the 14-year-old boy who made this fake tip, and Chief Inspector Mike Alderson said, quote, "Officers are working extremely long hours and malicious calls are making our job that much harder and waste precious time." Thankfully, legal action was taken against this boy because, yeah, like he should definitely suffer consequences for doing this. I think it's just like so evil and heartless to do something like that, to play with a family's emotions and to waste police's time. I don't get why someone would do this type of prank. Anyways, there was also another plausible tip called in shortly after. On July 12th, a garage worker near Glasgow, Scotland, claimed that he had CCTV footage of a girl matching Sarah's description with a man who resembled the e-fit image that police released. The man, who believed to see Sarah, said, quote, "She came in to use the toilet and a few minutes later, a man went up and said something. She shouted, 'I can't get out. The door's stuck.' I thought it was strange that a man was going to the toilet with her. Normally, a little girl would go to the toilet with her mom. That's what drew my attention to them." So he said that that really stood out to him, and also said that he was sure that this was Sarah because him and a colleague had studied the CCTV footage from the garage and both thought that there was a striking similarity between Sarah and this little girl. He added that they even compared the tape to pictures in the newspapers and they were like, no, like this has to be Sarah. So police looked into the sighting, they looked into the CCTV footage, but this sighting was ruled out and confirmed not to be Sarah. Sarah and Michael kept getting a glimpse of hope with all of these possible sightings and with all of these tips, and it just must have been so devastating and disheartening to hear that these led to nothing over and over again. Not only because of the sightings, but because they were also going through every article of clothing and children's toys found during the extensive searches for Sarah in fields and gardens and things like that, but none of them matched Sarah's. Authorities would literally present to them like, hey, we found this toy, does it belong to Sarah? Or hey, we found this piece of clothing, does it belong to Sarah? And it was just a little bit exhausting and draining for the parents to go through every single item and just be like, no, this isn't Sarah's, and just having to wonder like, is the next one going to be Sarah's? And if it is, what does that mean? I know it may sound like a little bit repetitive, but it's just so exhausting and it's just so emotionally draining to go through something like this, and it's just hard to wrap your head around what the Payne family felt during all of this time. I don't think words can describe how hurtful and how emotional this must have been, and it just makes me really sad to think about them going through this and going through all these toys and clothes and going through all of these tips just to have no answers. Thankfully, like I said, news reporters from all over the world were reporting on this case as well. Sarah's disappearance was everywhere, which was so helpful, but unfortunately, Sarah was nowhere to be found. Sarah and Michael continued to make public appeals where they both were just filled with grief. Sarah said during one of these appeals, quote, "Drop her at the end of the road. Just bring her home. Drop her at the end of the road. Put her somewhere she can be found. I don't care about you. I just want my baby. Just drop her somewhere she can be found. Let her walk away from you, please. It's getting harder with every minute, but we are optimistic that we are going to find her. We need Sarah. We need her. I know she will be very, very frightened indeed. She's a very soft little girl. She's perfect, and right now she will be very scared and frightened. If she's watching now, we're coming to find you, darling. As soon as we can, we will be there." She was saying these pleas through tears and while holding Michael's hand. All they wanted was for their baby to be returned home safely. Sarah's school also got involved and they spoke out about her disappearance. Her principal, David Sutton, said that when they heard that she was missing, the whole school was worried and they kept her in their thoughts and prayers. David said she was an immensely likable and friendly child, always thinking about others with compassion. She quickly became a part of the school community. She was fitting in very well with the other students, and she was just always eager to do her homework. Sarah had this small, close group of friends who looked out for one another, and these friends were also doing their best to get through this, but again, they're all like 8 years old, so just like imagine being 8 and having one of your close friends go missing. It just must have been something so difficult to understand. During this time, Sarah's school held 2 special assemblies to keep the students informed about what was happening. crying. Everyone wished their beloved friend would soon be back with them in the classroom and in the playground. The pop group Steps even spoke out about Sarah's disappearance. The members Claire, Lisa, Lee, Ian, and Faye recorded a heartfelt message for Sarah, hoping that wherever she was, she would hear it and remain hopeful that she would be returning home. This message from the band was played on TV and on the radio, and they ended it by urging anyone with information about Sarah's whereabouts to come forward and contact the police. This message just meant so much to everyone, and especially to Sarah's family. It really was a reminder that the entire nation was hoping for Sarah's safe return. Parents were holding onto their children's hands tighter while walking them to school, no longer letting them play in their front yards alone, and people were just being extra cautious. Parents were scared that this little girl appeared to have vanished into thin air and that this could have been anyone's child. What happened to Sarah was just so devastating to everyone. Unfortunately, on July 17th, 2000, after so many days of searching, dead-end tips, and countless pleas, the news the Payne family feared the most became a devastating reality. A body was discovered in a field around 12 to 15 miles away from where Sarah disappeared. The body of a little girl. It wasn't until the following day, however, that the body was formally identified as Sarah. The mom, Sarah, recalls the exact moment that she learned the news. She was holding on to every last piece of hope that she had in her until a police officer arrived at her home. She said that she had been forcing herself into thinking only positive things and that the thoughts of death or kidnapping were not allowed. So when the police officer arrived at her house and told her that they needed to speak privately, suggesting that they go outside to the garden, Sarah did what she could to delay the news. She just didn't want this to be true. She didn't want to hear what she already knew was coming. So she tried stalling. She said that they should wait to speak until Michael, who was out, returned home. But as she was trying to stall, Lee and Lou came running down to her in the garden with tears rolling down their cheeks, saying, "Is it true? Is Sarah dead?" And Sarah says that she just simply froze. She realized that the boys had heard the news on the TV before the police officer even got to break the news to her. Sarah was wrapping her head around the fact that her daughter was truly gone, that the boys had learned of it in the worst possible way, and that now the boys were angry at her and telling her, "You said you would tell us as soon as you knew." It was all just too much for Sarah to be hearing all at once, and all she wanted to do was fall to the ground and just cry. But she knew she couldn't just fall to the ground. She tried to remain calm. She insisted that she and Michael had to go identify the body, but police told her that they couldn't go see Sarah in the condition that she was in because it was really bad. That also must have been just so heartbreaking for Lee and Luke to hear on the news that their sister was dead. I mean, the fact that the news was already reporting it before police even had a chance to tell the family is just horrifying. So, who found the body? Well, a farm worker named Luke Coleman came across Sarah's body, which he initially believed to be an animal. As he got closer, he realized that it was the body of a young child that was near a hedge and partially pulled out of the shallow grave the body appeared to be buried in. Luke was in terrible shock and he went straight home to contact the police. Unfortunately, Sarah was found with no clothes on, with vegetation stuck to her, and parts of her body were taken by animals. An autopsy showed that she suffered a violent death, that she had been strangled, suffocated, and had most of her hair pulled out. There was no pathological evidence of a sexual assault due to the state that her body was in, but pathologist Vesna said, "In my opinion, from her appearance and the removal of her clothing, her death was likely the result of sexual motivated homicide." After hearing this terrible news, Sarah and Michael appeared in the media, thanking God that Sarah had now been located and that now their focus was finding the person who did this to her. Sarah said that no family should go through this, and through tears, Michael questioned why somebody would do this. The Payne family went to the field a few days later to see where Sarah had been found, and the area was now filled with flower bouquets and with teddy bears and balloons and just little things left by the community. Sarah said Charlotte wanted to take all of the teddy bears home, like that's how many there were. Each teddy bear and bouquet was a reminder from the community coming together to grieve with the family. In early August, a memorial service for Sarah was held at Guildford Cathedral. Prayers were read and a minute of silence silence was also held. After the memorial, 12 white doves were released, hundreds of teddy bears were brought in memory of Sarah, and the steps leading up to the cathedral were just full of flowers. It was a very emotional day and open to the public, so more than 800 people attended, which is just insane. Now, once the coroner released Sarah's body, her private funeral was held on August 31st at a church in their hometown, and it was just a very sad day. Sarah's family followed her coffin as it was being taken in the carriage, and the carriage was moving slowly, and the streets were full of people from the community showing their support. People were bowing their heads and just praying for Sarah. Luke says he just couldn't believe how tiny Sarah's coffin was. It was all just too much. The carriage had flowers on it, and it was drawn by 4 horses. After the funeral, there was a private burial, and Sarah's family had to make their final farewells to Sarah as her coffin was lowered to the ground. It was just such a painful funeral. I mean, just thinking about her little coffin, like she was only 8 years old, and I still can't believe how there's just evil people in this world that would do something so terrible to a little girl. In 2002, a bronze statue was placed in memory of Sarah in her school garden to honor her, and the playground was also rebuilt in her memory, which is just so beautiful. Her mom said Sarah absolutely adored going to school, so it was just a really sweet thing that they did for her. However, in 2015, the statue was stolen. I'm not sure who took the statue or why they did this, but thankfully it was found. It was restored, cleaned up, and placed back in the school garden later that year. Before reinstalling the memorial, the school chose to bury a time capsule beneath it, filled with items picked by the students, and also planted bright yellow and violet flowers around the base of the statue. So I do think that was a really sweet thing that the school did to honor Sarah. Now, going back to Roy, the news of Sarah's body being discovered spread like wildfire in his hometown where he was staying with his father. Everyone knew that Roy was a person of interest in this case and that he was a previously convicted sex offender, so a mob of angry vigilantes began. They started throwing stones and bricks at the house, they forced him to leave, and he basically left and just set up camp elsewhere and began living in a tent in a nearby field. With this, Roy was feeling pressure and he was growing paranoid. He knew he would no longer be welcome back at his apartment back where Sarah's grandparents lived, and now he wasn't even welcomed in his own hometown. He began feeling cornered and paranoid that any second now, police would arrest him for the abduction of Sarah. On July 20th, a children's shoe was recovered and taken in for forensic testing. A woman named Deborah Bray saw that the shoe was lying on the side of the road in a small village around 10 or so miles away from where Sarah's body had been found during the early stages of her disappearance, but initially thought nothing of this shoe. However, after news came out that Sarah's body had been found nearby, she thought that this could be important, that maybe this could be Sarah's shoe, so she went back to collect it and sent it to the police. Police asked Sarah's mom to identify the shoe, and her mom confirmed that this did belong to her daughter. So investigators began looking at the location where Sarah's shoe was found and where their prime suspect, Roy, had purchased diesel the day Sarah disappeared, and they determined that the shoe was found on a direct route from the gas station to where Sarah's body was found. So with this, police were like, okay, well, Roy maybe accidentally dropped the shoe or something like that as he was on his way to the gas station and as he was on his way to bury Sarah's body. So with this, Roy was arrested again, this time on suspicion of murder, and unfortunately had to be released once again due to lack of evidence and because Roy wasn't confessing or really cooperating. Police just knew that Roy was involved, but they just didn't really have any evidence to kind of stick the landing. All they had was the gas station receipt showing that he lied on his alibi and Sarah's shoe being found along the route. They really had nothing that they could formally charge him with, and it was just really infuriating for the police because they're like, dude, like, we know that this guy did it. We have him here right in front of us, but we can't make anything stick. It was also really scary for them to think about the fact, like, if we don't arrest Roy soon, he's still going to be out there and he can possibly hurt another little girl or boy. Police just felt a lot of pressure to find evidence to somehow get Roy behind bars and to actually have him remain there while they figured out how to connect him to Sarah's case. So they continued to search for evidence, but Thankfully, Roy's paranoia led him to make an impulsive decision that finally allowed police to get him behind bars and have him remain there. On July 23rd, Roy stole a car and a police chase ensued. Roy was going 70 miles an hour, which was way too fast for the area, when he crashed into a parked car and was arrested for dangerous driving and for vehicle theft. Roy was sentenced to 22 months in prison, and this was the best news that police had heard. Finally, they had Roy in custody long enough to get forensic evidence linking him to Sarah. Not only that, but now the public was a little bit safer with Roy behind bars because, again, everyone was worried that he could possibly hurt another little girl or another little boy. They began searching Roy's van, and what they found in there was just incredibly disturbing. It was honestly horrific. Police found a curtain with a clown pattern in the front, rope, a pickaxe, a bucket, knives, cable ties looped like handcuffs, sweet treats, and baby oil. All of these items were found along with some of Roy's clothing and other miscellaneous items. Forensics had a lot of testing to do, and it wasn't until 7 months after he was arrested that forensics were able to finally link him to Sarah's murder. So let's talk about this forensic testing. On a sweatshirt inside Roy's van, forensics found a single strand of hair belonging to Sarah on it. Not only that, but they also found 22 fibers from different items in his van that were found on the Velcro strap of Sarah's shoe. Police had to have as much evidence as they could to make this stick, and they also asked a forensic ecologist named Patricia for assistance, and she matched pollen, spores, and soil found on Sarah's body and the burial site to Roy's sweatshirt, sneakers, jeans, and a shovel he used. She deduced that Roy had likely fallen into the hedge during the crime, and that's why those materials were also found on his belongings. She said, quote, "The hedge itself was important. When I did get to his red sweatshirt, I could recognize the hedge on it. I think he fell into them because Sarah, bless her, she had stinging nettle all over her as well, and when you come to the end of the stinging nettles, that's where the grave was." So Patricia said that she initially believed Sarah's clothes were buried at a nearby golf course because she found that soil on Roy's shovel and it matched the soil at the Chilliton golf course. So they went to go search the golf course, but none of Sarah's clothes were found. So now Patricia thinks that Roy may have visited the golf course earlier, potentially scouting it as a place to bury Sarah, and that's how that soil got on his shoes. Patricia also compared ecological data from the site where Sarah's body was found and determined that Sarah had been buried at that location all along, with no signs of her body being moved. So with all of this forensic evidence, police could finally charge Roy and make it stick. Roy was charged with Sarah's abduction and murder on February 6, 2001, and his trial was set to begin in November. In the meantime, in July, a few days before the anniversary of when Sarah was found, Sarah and Michael were offered £11,000 from a UK government agency called Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority to help them after Sarah was murdered, with $11,000 being the maximum amount that was allowed to be rewarded under the law for the loss of a child through crime. Now, this money was meant to help them with their loss, but it was barely enough to cover funeral expenses. A victim support group called the Victims of Crime Trust thought that this amount was very small and unfair. They said it showed how little value was placed on Sarah's life. Sarah and Michael were actually quite upset as well. Sarah said she was encouraged to apply for compensation by police and said, quote, "If money is going to be used to reflect levels of suffering and loss, then this is crazy. We are appalled at what we have been offered. It is a sick joke." They were especially upset about this £11,000 offer because previous payouts for minor things were much higher. So just the year before, someone was giving a huge quantity of £62,000 for being called a slur. The director of the victim support group that I just mentioned, named Norman, said, quote, "The only thing the Paynes can do is join up with the other families and campaign for a change in the legislation. It is not really about the money. It is more about the state accepting the loss and showing some sort of respect for the family of someone who has been murdered." So yeah, Sarah's family is like, okay, we're offered £11,000 for the loss of our daughter, yet someone was offered £62,000 just because they were called a slur, which of course I'm not saying like being called a slur isn't a terrible thing, but they were just like, I mean, that just doesn't really make sense. Like, that's how little they value Sarah's life. I believe in the end, the family were given £8,000 based on a statement that Sarah made in 2010 after she learned that Ian Huntley, who murdered two young girls named Holly West and Jessica Chapman, was demanding £100,000 in compensation because he was attacked by a fellow inmate in prison. Sarah said, quote, "I got £8,000. Can anyone honestly tell me it can be right that the killer of Holly and Jessica should get £100,000? He shouldn't get a penny. It is appalling to think that he could have that as a nest egg if he is ever freed. But sadly, I believe the compensation culture of modern Britain will give him everything he is asking for and maybe even more. Sickens me. Now, let's move on to the trial. It began in November and news reporters from all over the world were outside reporting on the case. There were also angry mobs trying to get their hands on Roy. They were shouting at him. I mean, it was very chaotic. It was determined that Roy's previous conviction from 1995, when he abducted the 9-year-old girl, would be kept away from the jury to avoid Roy appealing his sentence if he was found guilty. You know, everyone was like, okay, if we include his past crime of abducting a little girl and he is found guilty, he could probably appeal it and say like, oh, they only found me guilty because of what I did before, not because of what I'm being accused of now. So they decided to remove that from the trial, but that also meant that it was going to be harder for the prosecution to convince the jury that Roy did this. They did have tight forensic evidence showing no one else in the world besides Roy could have murdered Sarah, so they did feel very confident about this conviction. They also had called 2 witnesses who recalled seeing Roy's van parked on the roadside where Sarah was found, so you know, they felt good about this. The trial began and Roy immediately pled not guilty. In the courtroom, Sarah could finally see the man who took her precious little princess away. She was nearly face to face with him, but Roy didn't even glance her way. He kept his head down during the trial, and Sarah just watched him closely and saw not the slightest sign of guilt or regret. Roy was even yawning at some points, like he looked like he was bored. He was kind of having like a faint smile at some points. He was like slouched in his chair and just like rocking back and forth. I mean, he honestly appeared just so casual about all of this, as if all of this was like a big inconvenience to him and as if he was bored being there. He was also taking some notes and like would be snappy to the prosecutors during questioning. His behavior was just very insane. Now, despite these claims of innocence, in December of 2001, Roy was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 50 years, meaning Roy would be 92 years old when he could be eligible for parole in 2051. Judge Richard Curtis told Roy, quote, "You are indeed an evil man. You are in no way mentally unwell. I have seen you for a month, and in my view, you are a glib and a cunning liar. As we all know, you stripped Sarah naked and you suffocated her and buried her and got rid of her clothes. You are indeed an evil man. What is more, you did the same thing in 1995, but that girl you mercifully did not kill. You are every parent and grandparent's nightmare come true. You are and will remain an absolute menace to any little girl. It's one of the rare cases where I shall recommend to the appropriate authorities that you be kept in prison for the rest of your life, so that no further child is added to the list of your victims and the lives of a third family are not ruined." I think that statement is just incredibly powerful and just very important for Roy to hear. I mean, who knows if he even like really understood what the judge was saying or even cared about that, but I think someone did have to kind of say that to him and kind of put him in his place and say like, you are a nightmare and we're going to do whatever we can to make sure that you remain behind bars for the rest of your life. Now, Sarah's mom said that she felt her legs go out when she heard the sentencing. A huge sense of relief came over her knowing that no other little girl or boy would be harmed at the hands of Roy. Now the family could begin truly healing knowing Sarah got justice and she could rest in true peace now. The whole family was hugging each other and they all wept together. Sarah's grandfather shouted, "I hope you rot in hell," to Roy as he was being led out of the courtroom, and Michael also joined in and began shouting like bad words and slurs at him. Outside the courtrooms, people were shouting at the van transporting Roy, and news reporters quickly shared the news. People all over the world shared the Payne's family's relief. Hundreds of messages showing support to the family came in, and everyone was just so happy that this was finally over. What happened to Sarah is just truly heartbreaking, and it's just so unfair and so cruel. She just must have been so frightened in those final moments and just also very confused. One second she was playing with her siblings, and the next she was trapped in a van with this evil and disgusting man. A man who had no regard for her life. It's just honestly gut-wrenching to think about what she went through and the pain that she went through. People were happy that Sarah got justice, but they were really angry after they learned that Roy was already convicted of doing this before, yet he was just out after 2 years and was living his life. People were outraged thinking about how Sarah would still be alive today if Roy hadn't been released from prison the first time. The media really began focusing on Dr. Farrington, the doctor that I mentioned earlier who said that Roy didn't have pedophile tendencies back in his 1995 trial. Headlines were being printed with his name on it, and the press were demanding interviews with him and were basically blaming him for Sarah's death. They were like, if he hadn't said that Roy didn't have, these pedophile tendencies, then Roy would have been in prison for a long time after the abduction of the 9-year-old little girl, and Sarah would still be here today. Dr. Farrington did speak out, and he said that he believed the media misinterpreted his findings, quoting only the defense's lawyer's version of his report. He said that his report on Roy stated that Roy didn't meet the official criteria for pedophilia because a diagnosis of pedophilia requires a consistent sexual interest in children over at least 6 months, not just one isolated incident, but did report that Roy would likely reoffend. He said, quote, "What people are overlooking is that in the report, I also said that there was a relatively high risk of Whiting reoffending. I said that I was extremely concerned by the way he had planned the attack, getting a knife and a rope ready in his van, although he said he impulsively snatched the girl. It was obvious that he had planned to frighten somebody with the knife, he had planned to tie somebody down with the rope, and afterwards he made great efforts to change his appearance. All this made me say that I thought he was likely to reoffend." So he's basically like, no, like the defense team misinterpreted what I said, and they started saying like, oh no, like this psychologist says that Roy isn't a pedophile, like let him go. And now the media is getting a hold of that and they're misinterpreting what he said. He says that he tried explaining this, but that he was ignored and was blamed for Sarah's murder. People thought there was no excuse for him thinking that Roy had no pedophile tendencies back in 1995 after he literally abducted and essayed a young girl. And again, if the report stated otherwise, Sarah would possibly still be here today. It's definitely a very confusing situation, so I would love to know what you guys think about this. Going back to Sarah's family, they endured the pain together, and although their deep wounds would take a very long time to heal, this day marked the beginning of a new chapter. Now, Sarah and Michael could focus on making sure that no other family ever suffered this pain again. At the time in the UK, the sex offender registry was not available to the public, and Sarah wanted to change that. She learned of Megan's law that was passed in the United States, which is a law allowing the public access to the sex offender registry, meaning that they could find out if a convicted sex offender was living nearby their home. Sarah and Michael wanted this to be brought to the UK as well, but instead of Megan's law, it would be called Sarah's Law. Sarah began this campaign with the support of a big magazine called News of the World, and the magazine printed a bold front page that caught everyone's attention. They printed the names, photos, and information of 100 sex offenders, and the magazine were asking for support to this campaign through a petition that gained nearly 1 million signatures. They were also planning to name shame thousands of more people. However, this did not get the outcome that they expected. The magazine printed this information with the intention to spread awareness of how many sex offenders are truly among us and to protect children, but it actually stirred a lot of controversy. People thought that by name shaming them, it would force these predators to hide or to lie about their address, and that this just made it more difficult for police to monitor them. Mobs actually began targeting individuals all over the UK, even forcing some families from their homes. It also led to a lot of suicide and innocent people just getting caught in the crossfire and being wrongfully accused. Although the campaign did get backlash, Sarah and Michael were determined to keep children safe, and they continued to fight for Sarah's Law to be passed. With News of the World still standing behind her, Sarah felt like she did have the credibility to walk into meetings with heads of government agencies and with powerful politicians. She said, quote, "You've got to know what you're talking about. You can't be the wailing, mourning mother. You've just got to get on with it." Which honestly, that made me sad hearing where she's like, I can't go in there crying and like a sad mom. Like I have to be strong and I have to seem confident to get these people to actually pass the law, when I feel like it also should be the other way around. Like a mother going to you begging and crying saying, I need this law changed because my daughter could have been saved if we had known this predator was nearby. I feel like that should have been enough to get this law passed, but it actually took years for this law to be passed, which we will get back to shortly. Now, while Sarah and Michael were trying to do this campaign and coping with the loss of their little girl, they were struggling in their marriage, and they ended up splitting in 2003 after being together for 18 years. Sarah says that it was all just too much. You know, everything was just putting such a big strain on their marriage, and the trauma that they endured just changed them both and took them to a place that they couldn't get out of. What Roy did to Sarah changed all of their lives forever. Michael spoke out and said, quote, "I have a lot of anger and bitterness inside me. I'm full of guilt and rage that I wasn't there to protect my little girl from that man. It hurts desperately that my Sarah will be looking down knowing that her family has has been ripped apart like this. I'm not the same person I was 3 years ago, but there's no point in Sarah and I blaming each other for the breakup of our marriage. We know that we both have our faults. We know we're not the same people we once were. The sheer enormity of the tragedy has changed us into very different people. We're different in how we cope with everyday tasks, how we communicate with each other, and how we're individually dealing with the grieving process. Although I won't be living at home, I'll always be there for her and the others in every way possible. It was a really hard thing to go through for the both of them, and it was even more difficult because Sarah was actually pregnant again. The pair were expecting twins, and Sarah was going to be giving birth shortly after their separation. This news obviously came at a strange time as they were both coping with the loss of Sarah, but they were also delighted to welcome their twins into the world, a world that they were working so hard to make safer for their children. Sarah said, quote, "It is a new baby and a new life, and I know that Sarah will be wearing her biggest grin and hopefully will send us a rainbow." Michael said the birth of their new baby girls would be so emotional and sad since he and Sarah are no longer together or married. However, he did emphasize that the babies would be welcomed into a loving family, and despite him not living at the family home, he will always be there for the babies and for his other children in every way he can. Now, unfortunately, according to an interview that Sarah did with the Irish Independent, she actually suffered a miscarriage of one of the twins she was carrying. So she gave birth to a baby girl in November of that same year who they named Ellie Jane. Breaks my heart that the entire family was dealing with the weight of this intense grief and guilt and were in a sense no longer the same people. You know, they had to deal with the death of Sarah and then also a miscarriage. Like, it's just too much for anybody to go through. In 2004, Sarah published a book called A Mother's Story, where she wrote about Sarah, where she wrote about the 17 agonizing days searching for her and the terrible day that she was told her daughter was no longer alive. She also wrote how her family struggled to cope with their grief and the pressure from the campaign for Sarah's Law. Fast forward a few years, Sarah was still being so vocal about children's safety, and she was actually awarded a MBE from the Queen in 2008. Now, an MBE, which stands for Member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, is given to those who have played a significant role in their community and who have made a notable and long-term impact nationally. Again, Sarah was working so hard in her campaign to get Sarah's Law passed, and she said that this was one of her proudest days in her life. In early 2009, Sarah was appointed as Victims Champion. This role was created for a limited time of 1 year to provide a voice for the 1.5 million yearly victims and witnesses of crime. Justice Secretary Jack Straw said her job will be to bring the concerns of victims of crime into sharp focus, making sure their views are heard when big decisions about policing or the criminal justice system are made. Sarah was really happy about this position, and she said that she was looking forward to bringing the voice of victims and witnesses to the heart of the government. She said that they're not looking at masses and masses of changes, but that she's here to challenge the government when they are doing something wrong. So Sarah was really busy with her advocacy work. As you can see, she was doing so much to, just keep Sarah's name out there and to also just protect other children. Her plate was extremely busy, and she was also still dealing with grief, which did begin to affect her health. In 2007, Sarah's first series of aneurysms began, and in December of 2009, she suffered a stroke that put her into a coma. Doctors said that she had a 50-50 chance of living, but thankfully Sarah woke up from the stroke. She was just in disbelief that this had happened, and she cried for 3 days. She said the recovery was very long and challenging. The stroke affected her movement and her memory, which made it difficult for her to work or communicate with her family. Unfortunately, the stroke also left Sarah's left side of her body partially paralyzed, but sleep became her refuge. She said in her dreams she could do the everyday things that she missed, like chopping vegetables, walking up the stairs, or folding laundry. She thankfully had a great support system, and she was making progress to get better, but she was still frustrated by her limited mobility. She didn't give up though, and she kept working on her rehabilitation exercises to just regain her independence. And again, she had the support of her children and the support of her family to get her through this. It just breaks my heart to hear what she went through. I'm like, this is just too much, dealing with the loss of your child and then dealing with a miscarriage and then now dealing with an aneurysm and with half of your body being paralyzed. It's just really heartbreaking. Now, fast forward to April of 2011, Sarah's Law was finally passed. Now, anyone could fill out an application to ask police to check if someone in frequent contact with their child has a sexual offense conviction. It empowered parents, and it sent a clear message to convicted sex offenders that their criminal history could not be hidden. In the first year, police received over over 900 applications, and according to Home Secretary Theresa May, 200 children were protected by Sarah's law. In 2013, however, concerns were raised about the effectiveness of Sarah's law after reports showed that only 1 in 7 applications resulted in disclosure. John Brown from the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children said, Sarah's law is not a silver bullet to end child abuse, and giving the public information about where sex offenders live is just one part of the jigsaw. This is a delicate balancing act and one that must be constantly reassessed. Ultimately, the route we must pursue must be guided by what we know keeps children safe, which is a coordinated approach including deterrence, treatment, and advice and information to the public. So even though there were concerns and challenges about the law, Sarah's influence was undeniable. I truly admire Sarah for working so hard to get this law passed and just her endless work and advocacy. She is truly a symbol of strength, and just reading all about her work really inspired me. In June of 2012, Sarah was awarded with an honorary doctorate from Open University for her child protection campaign. She just wasn't stopping, and she was making sure that her voice would be heard forever. Now, going back to Roy real quick, in 2010, his appeal for a reduction in his 50-year minimum sentence was granted, and it was actually reduced by 10 years. So now Roy will be eligible for parole when he is 82 years old instead of 92. Sarah was obviously disappointed when hearing this news, but she said, quote, he will be well into his 80s before he is eligible, so it's not a terrible thing and could have been a lot worse. So we carry on as before. He's in prison now. He can't hurt any children there. Now, since Roy's imprisonment, he has been the target of multiple attacks. The first attack happened in August of 2002 when Roy was slashed with a razor by a fellow inmate, leaving him with a 6-inch scar on his cheek. Another attack where Roy was stabbed in the eye was a sharpened plastic toilet brush handle. The tip of the brush broke off and actually left a piece of plastic in Roy's eye. Another incident happened when he was hit and scalded with a hot water flask by another inmate. Then another time he was stabbed. Another he was beaten by 2 inmates in his cell with a makeshift weapon consisting of 2 pieces of wood secured together with protruding screws. The 2 inmates snuck into Roy's cell and began beating and kicking him. A prison officer said that the inmates attacking Roy only stopped until they managed to force open the door. Roy said that he fell to the floor and he tried defending himself by going under his bed, but it was no use. He saw he was lying in a pool of his own blood. Roy actually stopped breathing and he had to be taken to the hospital. An officer said that they truly believed if they hadn't stopped the inmates, Roy would be dead. Now, this is something that is kind of common for, people that go to prison for these type of crimes, involving the assault of children. So people aren't really surprised that he is getting this treatment. Now, later, Roy spoke out and said, I have a couple of friends who I talk to, but I do also get quite a lot of verbal abuse. They call me names such as rapist, child killer. I do try to ignore the comments as I have to get used to them now. Now, apparently Roy spends his time alone constructing landmark models with matchsticks and is, again, absolutely hated by the other inmate. Now, Roy also began writing to someone that he thought was just like a regular pen pal. However, this friend that he was writing to in prison was actually an author named Bernard O'Mahony. Now, Bernard was posing as a woman named Emma in hopes to get Roy to reveal more details about Sarah's death. Bernard's book from 2012 called Flowers in God's Garden shares all the correspondence that he exchanged with Roy. Now, Bernard was actually a former criminal himself who became an author, and he played a key role in putting some of Britain's killers behind bars through letters that he would exchange with them. So that's what he was trying to do with Roy. He was pretending to be a girl named Emma so that he could get Roy to trust Emma and reveal more details about what actually happened to Sarah. But he said that despite all of his letters and everything, he just couldn't get Roy to crack. He was in complete denial about what happened to Sarah, and instead of actually talking about the details of her case and everything like that, he would just write to Emma, aka Bernard, about music and cars. If Roy ever did mention Sarah, he wouldn't even write her full name out. He would just write her initials SP. So one time Roy wrote, quote, after I was arrested and interviewed about SP and my white van, they bailed me to my father's house. I couldn't even get clean clothing from my flat, so I had to stay at my dad's house. The media got the address and I had to leave. I had nowhere to go. So yeah, he rarely spoke to Bernard about Sarah and again would only refer to her in her initials. Roy also said that he would be changing his name when he is released from prison, and he was even asking Bernard for any suggestions as to what to change his name to. He was thinking about changing his name name to either Gary or Ray, and he was basically just talking about how excited he was to be released and how he was going to be like a new person and start his life again, and he was even thinking about what job he was going to get when he got out. Again, he's not getting out till he's like 82 years old, if that even does happen. So the fact that he's just thinking about his new name and his new career like is insane. It's honestly just really chilling and disturbing how Roy has no guilt about what he did, how he destroyed so many lives, and how he won't even address Sarah using her full name. Now, to this day, Roy has never confessed to what truly happened that day, about why he took Sarah or how he took her or how it all happened, and people believe that he will take the truth with him to the grave. Now, moving over to how Michael has been since Sarah's passing, he unfortunately was really struggling. He felt guilty about Sarah's death and was battling depression and alcoholism. During the trial, he actually purchased a gun and said that he would take care of Roy if justice wasn't served. Luke, his son, said, "He came into our room when I was about 13 years old, sat me and Lee down, and just basically talked through what was going to happen if Roy Whiting got off that day." Now, later the gun was handed over to the police, and Sarah had to get the police to speak to Michael and basically calm him down. I mean, she was like, "Listen, I don't blame Michael for wanting to basically kill Roy. Like, I understand that anger and frustration, but if he does that and if he becomes a killer, then he's gonna become a very different human being." Michael also attempted to take his own life at one point, which led to him seeking treatment, and unfortunately in October of 2014, Michael passed away in his home at 45 years old. His father Terrence said, "After the incident, we all went downhill a bit, but we managed to pull ourselves together, whereas Michael really struggled. We all knew Mike had demons, but it's sad it has come to this. It's terrible that Whiting will one day see the outside of a prison when he has left so much destruction in his wake. All Michael wanted was for his little girl to be back with him, and the pain and just destruction that Roy caused for the Payne family is so devastating and just infuriating. The grief was just so relentless and just affected the entire family. It just breaks my heart that Michael fell into such a deep depression, and of course I understand, like, it's incredibly difficult to have to deal with the aftermath of something like this happening to you, but God, it just makes me so angry how Roy destroyed everything and everyone." As for Sarah's siblings, they also struggled a lot in the following years after, and they struggle even to this day. Lee, who was the one who actually saw Roy, says, "When it comes to feeling guilt about the situation, I did for a few years beat myself up about it, thinking that if I'd maybe run faster or not run through the corn, I might have caught up with her. Thinking that if I had my head on that day, I'd realize she was in the back of the van." Luke has suffered anxiety and nightmares from that day, saying, "I'm scared to sleep at night half the time, so I work myself solid until I pretty much drop. It's fears of what's there when I close my eyes. I create things that didn't happen or things that could have happened. I make up scenarios up in my head. It just eats me away, so I don't get a lot of sleep, really. I dread the nighttime because it's just you and your thoughts. They are all there, and it's so real."
I dread the night time when it comes to that point, when I put my head on that pillow, because it's just you and your thoughts. I'm scared to sleep at night half the time, so I work myself solid till I'm pretty much drop, because it's fears of what's there when I close my eyes.
Just hearing their interviews and just listening to their statements breaks your heart, because like Lee feels so guilty. He's like, if I had just known she was in the back of the van, if I had just been smarter about it, or just like realized like she had just been abducted, then maybe I could have like saved her. And it's like, he was only like a young boy, you know, they were 11 and 13 years old. So I feel like that's just way too much guilt and responsibility that they feel on their shoulders. And it just breaks my heart that they feel like they could have done more when they were just kids themselves. As for Charlotte, who was only 5 years old at the time, she grieves a bit differently, saying that she feels sad that she can't really remember much from that day and that she can't really relate to her family's pain. But she says that she's incredibly proud to have been Sarah's sister and will never forget the beautiful memories that they created together, that she does remember, and that she will pass those memories off to her own children someday. They each have like a different perspective of what happened that tragic day, and again, it has all affected them so deeply but also very differently. Ellie, who unfortunately did not get the chance to meet her older sister, hears about her through her family's memories. In 2021, on what would have been Sarah's 30th birthday, Luke shared a special message on social media that I just found really touching. "So today you would have been 30. Wow, 30. I last saw you when you were 8. We never got to experience much more than childhood banter, arguments, and petty point scoring. I never got to experience being your friend or being a big brother you could rely on or cry to when you need. Just watch you grow and be proud to watch you become a woman, and I think we would have been the best of friends, and I miss that. I feel that is why there's an empty void in my existence, just a hole where you used to be. I miss not sharing with you, going through to this next stage of what would have been your life. It's a big day for you. Today, you would have officially joined adulthood, the dirty 30s, but you will forever be a child trapped in innocence. Rest in peace. That is just such a beautiful message, and I can't believe how many years have passed since this happened. And Sarah's mom said that it was just really hard watching all of her classmates and friends grow up, and she just kind of wonders, what would Sarah have been doing now? She tries to keep Sarah involved in their daily lives, and they have this huge picture on the wall of the family, and right next to it is a large picture of Sarah. So in a way, Sarah's like still part of the gang, she's still a forever part of the family. She's still there watching over them and just seeing what their lives have become. Sarah's mom also said that the coroner very kindly cut her a loop of Sarah's hair, and that every now and then she just looks at her daughter's hair and touches it and just remembers that her daughter was real. This wasn't just a horrible memory. This wasn't just a nightmare. She wasn't just a girl on a missing poster. Like, she was a real person. She was actually her daughter. She was someone who had such a bright life ahead of her and just didn't deserve this. Sarah was like, sometimes just by touching her hair, it reminds me that she was actually here with me and that she literally came from me. In 2017, Sarah published a second book titled Letters to Sarah. In a series of letters she wrote to her daughter, Sarah shares her grief, her love, and the deep connection that she still feels with her daughter. She says she talks to Sarah almost every day in her mind, discussing simple things like the weather and just like little things, and that these conversations just help her feel closer to her daughter. Writing letters to Sarah has become a way for her to cope with the pain of missing out on her daughter's teenage years and beyond. It has made Sarah feel more present in her life, even after all these years, and it's just a way of putting all of these thoughts and emotions on a piece of paper and, again, just allowing her to connect with Sarah. She also would watch Sarah's favorite movies, just imagining that they were sitting on the couch together watching them. Sarah also said sometimes it's as if she can hear her daughter like giggle. She said that the first time that she heard it was during Roy's trial back in 2001, when a small door/gate in the courtroom kept swinging open, no matter how many times the guards tried to close it. She said, quote, "That's when I first heard it in my head. It was one of her giggles at the top of her voice, and it felt like she was right there being mischievous." I honestly just teared up listening to the family speak about Sarah and just speak about everything that they have gone through after her death. God, it breaks my heart. Just hearing the mom say like touching her hair makes her remember that Sarah was real and not just a horrible memory. That part to me just got me because, wow, like she is just so incredibly strong. The whole family is so strong, and I just truly send them all my strength and love and support. I hope that they are living a wonderful life and have found peace and joy through all of this sorrow. Those who knew Sarah were very lucky, and she will always be remembered. I know that this was such a difficult case to listen to. Any case that involves children is heartbreaking, but I think it's so important to talk to your children about stranger danger. Of course, I'm not saying that Sarah made a mistake by getting into Roy's van or that she failed or did anything wrong. We don't even know how she got in the van. We don't know if Roy lured her with the sweet treats he had in his van, if he said something to her, or if he literally just grabbed her and threw her inside the van. We don't know, but either way, I think it is important to have a conversation with your kids about being aware of their surroundings, about the buddy system, and just again about stranger danger. It's frightening how these things can happen in a matter of seconds. Sarah's brothers were literally right behind her. Lee was in touching distance of her, like he could have reached his arm out and grabbed her, and yet Sarah was still kidnapped in a matter of seconds. It's frightening how quickly this can happen, and I just wish that this evil didn't exist in the world and that no other child would have to go through something like this, but unfortunately that's not the reality that we live in. So please have these conversations with your children and just stay safe out there. All right, you guys, I think that's pretty much all the information I have for today's video. I appreciate you guys so much. I know this was such a long video and also just so difficult and emotional, but just very important to continue to spread awareness on what happened to Sarah and just keep her name out there. I would love to know what you guys think about this down below. I think it's just disturbing to know that Roy has children of of his own. Like the fact that he has a son and possibly a daughter is truly disturbing. I mean, this man is so sick and evil, and the fact that he was already convicted of doing something like this before and was released after 2 years is just so disrespectful and honestly just like a slap in the face. But yeah, I would love to know what you guys think about this down below, and if there are any other cases you would like me to cover, also make sure to leave me a comment down below, or you can also submit it through my case suggestion, which is in the description box down below. Again, if you guys are new to this channel, I hope you guys can hit the subscribe button and join the familia. We have something exciting coming very soon on September 15th, so you definitely want to stay tuned for that because, you know, big changes are coming to this channel and I'm very excited about it. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have to say. Thank you guys again so much for being here, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye, familia!